Well, thank you all for praying with me. That's a very important part of our Wednesday night service. I always want to continue that, and it can be a little bit difficult sometimes. We try to kind of push a lot of things in all at one time on Wednesday nights, don't we? We, especially last Wednesday, was a doozy because we threw a business meeting in there as well. Please, I mentioned it when we opened the services, but keep praying about our Easter celebration. I'm very thankful for Miss April and others that are working to help get things together. They're looking at pricing out a banner we can put on our post out here, and we're going to do what we can to try to get the word out. We already got it on Facebook. She did an excellent job putting a little advertisement on Facebook, and with all the details, it looks really nice. And so if you go to the Stanfield Facebook page and you find that, you can share that with all your friends, because don't just assume because you can see it, your friends can, because unless your friends follow Stanfield Baptist Church, they probably won't see it. So if you go there and click share and share it with your friends or share it publicly, that would be a blessing. Get the word out. I'm glad we got an early start on that, but it'll be here before you know it. It'll be here quickly. So please be praying about that. And so this evening, we're going to try our very best in the next 30 minutes or so to conclude what we've been studying for several months now, which is talking about God's creation. And, sometimes when we've talked about it, we've had a lot of Bible verses, a lot of Bible. Sometimes it's been more science type things, and we'll kind of have probably a little more on the science side tonight. I hope it's not too dry. I hope that you will. We're going to try to move through it quickly, so you have to listen closely, because we're going to be moving pretty quickly. And what we're going to really focus in on tonight, because we've talked a lot about the age of the earth according to the Word of God and the genealogies in Genesis and on through the Bible. We talked a lot about the creation in general and how God made everything. We talked about the worldwide flood, which explains the fossil record. It explains the geologic column. It really, all those things are simply explained by the worldwide flood that happened in the days of Noah. And, I'll say it one more time just because it's a good thing to kind of reverberate in your mind. If there was a worldwide flood that covered the highest mountain, what would you expect to find? Well, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. And that's what you see. And so you see all these fossil graveyards all over. And, the reminder of what that is, that's a reminder of God's judgment. Don't forget the reason for the flood. The world was very wicked and it was violent. The earth was filled with violence and it was wicked. Remember, the Bible says the thoughts and the imaginations of their heart was only evil continually. So God set out to judge His creation. He has every right to do that. Well, remember, one day in the future, God's going to judge His creation again, and He'll do it the next time with fire. And so when we think about these things and we teach these things, there's so much practical application in that there's an opportunity to witness to people, to see, hey, there's a coming judgment, and you need to be prepared for that coming judgment. And so we're going to try this evening to quickly go through some things. You remember last week I wanted to get into that part about some of these dating methods that so-called science uses today, and how those are very flawed and fallible. There's a lot of assumptions made in these. We can't cover them in great detail. You can research yourself as much as you would like or to your heart's content. And so we're going to go ahead and look at some of these things. But I wanted to have this verse here at the beginning. It says, we shared this last week, "Or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee, who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this." The creation, the Creator is so clearly seen in His creation that men are without excuse, and we've definitely covered that thoroughly. Just some things to show how the earth cannot be millions and yea, billions of years old. Well, one of those is something me and Caitlin discussed the other day, and I don't think I was able to explain it very well. But, if the earth is spinning at over 1,000 miles per hour, we don't feel that, do we? We don't feel the earth moving. And she was asking me questions about, what about people on the other side of the earth, Because, in your mind you think, well, they'll be upside down. No, they're right side up just like we are. It's just this world is so huge. But just to keep in this idea of the earth spinning, there's something that most people don't realize, but did you know the rotation of the earth is slowing down? It's slowing down a little bit. In this article here in 1990 says, but regular clocks use days as a measure, but are growing longer by 1,000th of a second or more daily as Earth's rotation slows. And so what we're going to talk about in a minute, we have a leap year every 4 years, but there's actually what they've dubbed a leap second. They have to add a second every so often. So it's take a second away. And so Earth's rotation is slowing down. And to compensate for this lagging motion, June will be 1 second longer than normal. This leap second, announced by the International Earth Rotational Service in February, will keep calendar time in close alignment with international time. It's pretty interesting. And so here's different years that had a leap second. And there's something that's important to know about the rotation of the Earth. The rotation of the Earth, the spin of the Earth, it causes the Coriolis effect. It causes a lot of the wind patterns we see all over the Earth. We had some problems with some of the wind patterns recently that caused this great, Arctic, winds and Arctic air to come way down here to Arkansas. So there's these prevailing wind patterns, and it's this Coriolis effect. And so this next slide is going to be kind of silly, but I have an answer for how dinosaurs went extinct. Because if you think about the Earth is slowing down, and we're losing a second every couple years or so, well, then that means in the past it was spinning a lot faster, especially when you add millions and then even billions of years ago. And so my theory is the dinosaurs went extinct because the Earth was spinning so fast back then, it just slung them off. And I'm just kidding, right? We know most of the dinosaurs went extinct during the flood in the days of Noah. And then 2 of every kind of dinosaur went on Noah's Ark. And then after the flood, they were hunted, and they were not, they were pests in some ways. And we talked all about that. We don't have time to cover that tonight. But, there are little things like this that show that Earth must be young, and it's not old at all. The Sahara Desert has a prevailing wind pattern. And, this causes desertification. So, the Sahara Desert is bigger today than it was a year ago, or it was 10 years ago, etc. And so they've estimated the Sahara Desert is around 4,000 years old. Isn't that interesting? Because around 4,400 years ago, there was a big flood that destroyed the entire world, went higher than the highest mountain. And so you would expect that the biggest desert in the world would be less than 4,400 years old, right? Well, that's what we see. And so that's just an example of one thing. They've looked at the pressure of oil in the Earth's crust. And oil wells, and this is kind of mind-boggling, that they can have pressures up to 20,000 psi. We talked a little bit last week about how a lot of the planets are still very warm, and how if they were really billions of years old, they would have long since cooled down. Remember, we talked about Jupiter and how even the sun, the heat from the sun can't compensate to the point where Jupiter is cooling down rather rapidly. So why does Jupiter still have any warmth, any heat at all? Well, so this is another thing like that. Why is there these great pressures in the crust of the Earth? And so scientists have determined that, these rocks should only be able to hold this kind of pressures for less than 10,000 years. Well, isn't that interesting? Because according to the Word of God, the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. It's around 6,000 years. And so we know that oil and gas are made from organisms that once lived, and they were changed by heat and pressure. And so I think it goes without saying, because I mentioned this in weeks past, but, oil is just dead, squished up animals, and coal is just dead, squished up plants. And the explanation of why we find, hundreds, millions of gallons probably of oil that's underneath the crust of the Earth, and we find all of these are in the crust of the Earth, and we find all of these giant coal seams to where we have coal power plants, and we've been using coal for hundreds of years. Well, the explanation is there was a worldwide flood that destroyed everything that was alive on the Earth. So all the coal, all the oil you see, they are not some reminder of millions of years ago, like, Sinclair gasoline says, but no, rather they're a reminder of the worldwide flood. And so sometimes people have this idea, and we're going to look at some things that are pretty interesting. They will tell you that things take a long time to make. But we know that's not true. We have synthetic oils today. They recommend now in these newer vehicles you run synthetic oils, man-made oil. And once you think about this, in 1996, there was a $22.4 million proposal was approved in Western Australia that will build a plant to create oil from sewage sludge in 30 minutes. So there's things that we think, oh, it had to take millions of years for this oil to form. No, it can happen very rapidly in a short amount of time. We're going to look at more examples of that in a minute, but we're going to switch gears for a second and look at a couple things that so-called science will say proves the earth is old, but it actually proves the earth is young. And so they have these ice cores, and there are certain places like in Greenland, which, remember, Greenland is not green. It's the opposite, right? Iceland is the one that's better off, a little bit warmer there. I don't know why they have them named flip-flopped there, but when you think of Greenland, they drill down and they drill these ice cores, and what they see these layers in the ice. Well, they'll try to tell you that each one of those layers corresponds to a year, and you can try to date the earth or something, or date how long that ice has been there by the layers. And so they have these, the government spend all this money. It's just ridiculous if you think about the things money are spent on, right? So there's people who get to go out there and bore these holes and get these ice cores out. They store them in giant freezers like this one in Denver, Colorado. And they have these different places, different sites all over Greenland they've drilled down. And here's one of their ice coring machines. And, there's these people that go out and they do this. And they take these ice samples, and as you can see in this next slide, they'll see these little rings, if you will, in the ice core samples. And so the so-called scientists today will say, well, these rings represent summer, winter, summer, winter. So in other words, they can determine the age of them because that's what they say. Each ring indicates the change of the season from summer to winter. Well, I want you for just a moment to think about what they're saying and think about how the weather is in Arkansas. We had these record cold temperatures, right? We had snow and ice and record cold temperatures, negative degrees, or negative zero, whatever. Zero doesn't have a negative, but we had all these super cold temperatures, and then literally 2 days later, it's like 70 degrees outside. And what's interesting is the temperature doesn't just change from warm to cold and cold to warm over the course of a year or a season, but it happens often. These ice rings, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, these are not summer, winter, summer, winter. These are warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. So they say, in Greenland and Antarctica, where the weather is consistently dry and very cold, the glaciers are miles thick, but the annual rings are very thin. The deepest cores can measure over 10,000 feet. Now, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? There's 5,000 feet in a little over 5,000 feet in a mile, right? So these cores, they're drilling down a couple miles deep of ice. It's just quite amazing. And so what's interesting, though, is that even with their messed up dating methods, they show that, these cores are from 135,000 years ago. Certainly not millions of years ago, right? Another thing that's pretty neat, and this is just a little known fact, there was some bombers during World War II that had to land, an emergency landing on Greenland, and this is pretty crazy. So in 1942, these planes landed in Greenland, and years later, these people wanted to go and dig them up, basically, and say, hey, we want to go find these. Now, this next slide is going to be baffling. The Lost Squadron, so think about this. This was 1942. When they went to dig down to take these planes, they had to take them apart and bring them back up through these tunnels that they dug down. The Lost Squadron was covered in 263 feet of ice in 48 years. That's a lot of ice that was laid down in those number of years. And you know what they found when they dug down to take these planes apart? They found these rings when they drilled down there. There were many hundreds of layers of ice above the planes when they dug them out. So isn't that interesting? It was only about 50 years, but there were hundreds of rings in that 50 years. Because they know when the planes crashed, right? Or landed. They didn't crash. They landed on the ice. They know that was 48 years, but then they look and see that there were hundreds of layers of ice, hundreds of rings, if you will. And so the article still calls these ice core lines annual layers when they are just simply warm, cold, which we know happens in the blink of an eye. Another thing that kind of shows the earth is young is things like the Bristlecone pine tree, known to be the oldest living organism on the earth. And if you'll see in some books, they may say over 4,400 years ago, years old. But keep in mind that tree rings are a very similar way of dating. They're not perfectly 100% accurate. because they'll say, well, these tree rings are annual, and they're not always annual, because you can have drought, which can cause the tree not to even make a ring, or you can have very wet seasons, and you can have basically these variables that make it where you may have more rings in a year or less rings and not even have a ring in a year. But it's interesting to know, even though that it's not a 100% perfect dating method, all of these, and I think it's even fascinating to think that there's a tree on this world that is close to 4,300, 4,400 years old. And, explains and shows that we have a young earth, because if those trees can live that long, well, why aren't they 10,000 years old? Even though with taking into account all the, guesstimations that come along with the tree rings, it's pretty interesting stuff to think about. You might not have even known there were trees in the world that were that old. And so when you think about what happened during the days of the flood, it says about Noah here, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. That's very clear. When you have somebody who tells you, no, this wasn't a worldwide flood, because a lot of people believe that today, they'll say it was just a local flood. It was just a local flood. Well, the Bible says it covered, the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills were covered. And so, pretty fascinating stuff too. If the earth were reduced to a 12-inch globe, all the water in the oceans wouldn't even fill a tablespoon. That's kind of fascinating. But then another fascinating little factoid. Today, the oceans average 12,000 feet deep. That's very deep, by the way. If the earth were smooth, the water would be 8,000 feet deep, 1.5 miles everywhere, if everything was flattened out, if you will. The oceans are huge. We don't have time to cover this. We covered this before. But what I like to say about the flood is I think it's just irrefutable evidence of a worldwide flood. Things like oyster shells found 11.5 feet, that were 11.5 feet wide, found on the top of the highest mountains. This one here was found on this mountain range in Peru. They found 500 fossilized giant oysters were found 2 miles above sea level. And notice that the oysters, when oysters die, they open up. When you go along the beach, it's rare to find one closed. If you do, it's probably still alive. If it's dead, it's opened up, and you're going to find half of it probably. Or you're going to find it opened up, and it's still hinged there. But these things would have had to have been buried rapidly, like just in what would explain that? It's something like a worldwide flood. They were buried rapidly. They didn't have time to die and open up. They did die, they just didn't have time to open up. And you see that over and again in the fossil record, these clams, because when they die, they normally open up, but they were buried very rapidly. The other thing you see is, we talked about earlier, fossil graveyards. You see just piles and piles of things like Dead Sea creatures and crustaceans. But even fragile things like eggs and dinosaur eggs, they were fossilized. They were covered so rapidly, if they would have been staying on the surface somewhere, they would have been cracked, or other predators would have eaten them, and different things like that. And so there was this great deluge of water. The fountains of the great deep were broke up. The waters prevailed. And, we talked about this thing, hydrological sorting, how all the different layers can be explained by the density of the rocks and the sediments and things like that, and even the density of the different organisms that were buried and all that. And turbidity is also an interesting thing. Water, we talked about, can damage things. And you can use a water almost like a laser and cut through metal and all kinds of things. Think about this, and this is also fascinating to me. These cables, like these fiber optic cables that they will stretch from North America all the way over to Europe, and they lay them on the seafloor. They had one of these transatlantic cables was cut by basically turbidity currents, these currents of water down on the ocean floor that was traveling at an estimated 70 miles per hour, and it basically destroyed a part of this transatlantic cable. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. And so the concentration of these fossils, there's just these great fossil graveyards. And so think about this. The South African paleontologist estimated that there are 800,000 million skeletons of vertebrate animals in the Karoo Formation. This is just one formation. This is one place where they're digging for fossils. It's just a fossil graveyard. The only thing that explains that is a worldwide flood. And so we don't have time to cover all these slides. But this is what I want to slow down for just a minute, because this is neat. We think of things petrifying. We think of it taking hundreds, thousands, millions of years. That's what the scientists will say. It takes a long period of time. But things to be petrified, it can happen very rapidly. There's scores of examples been given of plants or animals petrifying in much less than 100 years. Here's a picture of a petrified water wheel. We showed this slide before. Here's a picture of a piece of wood, a block of wood that's been cut or chopped with an axe of some kind, and it's petrified. You can clearly see the saw marks. We showed this slide before, a petrified dog in the tree. We talked about how things can be buried quickly and they can be fossilized quickly because, here's a fish about to give birth of some sort or lay eggs or something. You got a petrified cowboy leg found in a boot. That was an interesting one we looked at. But then here's some ones we didn't cover. Here's a petrified hat found in New Zealand. Okay, this is not something that's even 100 years old, more than likely. It's much younger than that. There was a petrified man. Now this is kind of fascinating. So there was a man who was buried, but his coffin wasn't tight, and water got in it, and water flowed through there. And this petrified man was found after being buried for only 14 years in Gainesboro, Tennessee. He died in 1881, and water ran through the grave and turned his body to stone. And so that's a pretty neat little thing. The occupant of the coffin had been turned to stone, presumably as a result of the continual flow of water and perhaps the minerals in it over such a long period of time, which 14 years is not that long of a period of time when you really think about it. And it was examined by many doctors and proclaimed to be genuine. Here's one that hits really close to home. Did you know about this? I don't know all the history. I'd like to know more about it, but apparently what we see as Eureka Springs today is built on top of the old Eureka Springs. And if you've ever been there, they'll talk to you about that a little bit. But there's actually on display a petrified sack of flour. It says in this little sign, and this is something, I'm not sure where they had this on display at. It is commonly believed that petrification is a process taking millions of years. Not true. Under ideal conditions, petrification can take place in as few as 3 weeks. You are looking at parts of petrified flour sacks from the Blue Spring Mill. Isn't that interesting? So a sack of flour that's petrified, it's like hard as rock. It's become rock. It's become mineralized, if you will, just because it's been mainly wet with water that's run over it that is full of minerals, and it's been, taking on those minerals. And again, because there was a lot of, I think, flooding and issues in this what was left of the old Eureka Springs. And you probably know more of the history about that than I do. We don't have time for that, and I don't know the story very well. But we talked about the geologic column before and all the fossil sorting, but we know it's just sorted by their density and things like that. And they're not well sorted like the textbooks teach. And it's not something that you can see. We talked about this. The geologic column can't be found anywhere in the world. It's only found in the textbooks. And we talked about, the circular reasoning that they go by, and they date the rock layers by the fossils, the index fossils. They date the index fossils by the rock layers they found them in, and all these things. But the best way to explain the way fossils are sorted is by the worldwide flood and these different layers. They was based on their habitat, their intelligence, their mobility, their body density, all these kind of things. And you've got things like liquefaction. You can see how really rock can almost be turned to mush, and water, just a slurry of things, and all these kind of things. And all these things, what they actually prove is a young Earth. But I want to keep moving because I've got some other stuff that's pretty interesting. And again, we talked about the flood covering the highest mountains. We talked about, where did all the water go? Well, the water assuaged or it went down. And the waters that stood above the mountains, it's basically as if the water... I'm going to escape out of here for just a second and try to save us some time because I want to make sure we can finish tonight. We only got about 12 minutes left. Because I want to get to this section right here, which is good. All right, here we go. So we're talking about how the Earth is young and how you can actually prove these things don't take a long time. It doesn't take long for something to be petrified. It doesn't take long for something to be, in essence, fossilized. It also doesn't take a long time to form stalactites and stalagmites. Caitlin knows this very well because she learned about these at school recently. the fourth graders at Conway Christian normally go to Blanchard Springs Caverns, but they didn't get to go this year because of COVID. But Miss Rogers still went through the whole thing and taught them all about the cave, got them all really geared up to go, and maybe we'll get to go there. We have been through a cave before, but not the one at Blanchard Springs since Caitlin's been born. But this is what scientists will say. They'll say New Mexico's unfinished symphony was started 250 million years ago. They'll say that it takes, thousands, if not millions of years for these stalactites and stalagmites to form. Well, that's simply not true. There's been 50-inch stalagmites under the Lincoln Memorial. Now, this picture here is the ones hanging down. We know those are the stalactites, right? Because they're hanging down. The stalagmites are the ones that come up from the floor. But that's still pretty fascinating. That happened, the Lincoln Memorial's not been around that long. It's certainly not been around for millions of years. It was built in 1922, and the photo you see there is from the 1960s. Bats that have been covered up with stalagmite, it's crazy how fast these things happen. Here's something interesting. Here's a refrigeration shed built sometime in 1926 to 1927, and look, there are 2-inch long stalactites hanging there from this mineralization. We're going to see some more interesting examples of that. This took 40 years to form in Indiana, and Caitlin may know the name of it, but there's a name for when a stalactite and a stalagmite come together. What is that called, Caitlin? You remember? A column. So a column was formed here, and only took 40 years there in Indiana. It says geology textbooks tell us that stalagmites and stalactites form at a rate of thousands of years per cubic inch. So they say it takes thousands of years for it to grow an inch. Obviously, at such slow rates, it would take a very long time to form them. The public is often exposed to claims of these great ages by tour guides in commercial caverns. And it says here, George Roger Clark Memorial is built on the banks of the Wabash River at Vincent. I can't want to say the name of that town wrong. Somebody who's watching and is from there would probably be mad. But Vincennes, Indiana. The limestone came from Bedford Quarry near Bedford, Indiana, just 6 miles from the entrance of Blue Springs Cave, one of the most beautifully decorated caves in the world. Water percolates down through cracks in the memorial building into the basement as it does in caves, and the result is the same kind of formation as found in the cave. Stalagmites, stalactites, as well as 5 columns 11 feet tall are found in the basement. This building was 40 years old when these pictures were taken. What does this say about the claims of great ages for cave formations? And I know you couldn't read that. I wanted to read it to you because they did a really good job of explaining that. Here's another example. This picture was taken in 1987, level 5 of a lead mine in Mount Isa, Queensland, Australia. The mine was only 55 years old at the time, and look at these stalactites and stalagmites. Here's a stalactite growing under a building. Building was open in the fall of 1993. Let's look at a few others that are pretty neat. The TP Fountain. This structure started in 1903, was created by piping. So what they did, there was basically a hot mineral spring water coming up. They put a pipe in the ground, right? So they put in it says, they created by piping the hot mineral water through a vertical pipe built into a rock pyramid. And as the water exits the top and flows over the structure, it cools and deposits travertine, much the same as terraces are formed near the Bighorn Springs within the park. The algae within the water colors the deposits. So you know about mineral deposits, right? You know about iron in your sink. You know about lime in your sink and things. Thankfully, we don't see that much because we have city water nowadays, right? I had well water, I guess, from when I was a 4th grader till I graduated high school. So I definitely know about irony water and sulfury water and all those fun things. But this is that formation. So did you catch that? They piped this in 1903. Look at this huge formation, this flowstone that was created just in a little over 100 years. It's quite fascinating. Here's another one, a 100-year-old flowstone in Wyoming. Can happen in a very short period of time. And so those are some of the things I enjoy. I like to see things that are fossilized rapidly. These things that they claim take thousands or millions of years to form, we can prove are formed rapidly. Well, but then now we'll look at a couple other things to finish this off for our discussion of creation and for tonight. But think about some of these things in more general terms. There's only, they say the the first fully developed systems of word writing appeared only about 5,000 years ago. Well, why don't we see literature? Why don't we see writings older than that? That's an interesting question. The oldest language that can reasonably be reconstructed is already modern, sophisticated, complete form from an evolutionary point of view. So they don't know how to explain this. Why aren't there writings older than that? In the Chinese calendar, they show the Earth to be less than 6,000 years old. So they're not perfect on it, but maybe they started dating around the time that of one of Noah's children who came off the ark, because they do think that one of Noah's 3 children may be kind of the father of the people who went to the east. And so our year 2000 was the year 5759 on the Hebrew calendar. I mean, that's less than 6,000 years old. And so why are the oldest reliable historical records less than 6,000 years old? That's interesting. And I wanted to share this with you real quick and then we're going to finish up with these radiometric dating methods. But I want to show you how easy it is to be brainwashed. Once upon a time, once you think about this, envision this in your mind, a man left home jogging. I like to run. Some of you like to run. A man left home jogging. He jogged a little ways and he turned left. He jogged a little ways and he turned left. He jogged a little ways and he turned left, and he jogged back home. As he was jogging home, he noticed 2 masked men waiting for him at home. The question is this: who are the masked men, and why did he leave home jogging? And you're probably thinking in your mind, you've got something, you've painted a picture in your mind of what you think that is. All right, so let's look at it again. A man left home jogging. He jogged a little ways and turned left. He jogged a little ways and he turned left. He jogged a little ways and he turned left, and he jogged back home. As he was jogging home, he saw 2 masked men waiting for him. Anybody figured it out yet? Who were the masked men, and why did he leave home jogging? Anybody got an idea, a clue? Here's the answer. A man left home jogging. He jogged a little ways and he turned left. He jogged a little ways and he turned left. And he jogged back home. And when he got back home, there were 2 masked men waiting for him at home. The catcher and the umpire. And so I simply say that to say we get a lot of things that are taught to us in a certain way, with a certain slant, with a certain agenda. And we, in our mind, envision and they want us to paint a picture, a certain narrative. But it may be not at all what we think it is. Now let's quickly go through these radiometric dating methods. Let's talk for just a few minutes, and we have just a few minutes left, about carbon dating. Now, the Earth's atmosphere is about 100 miles thick. That's very thick, but we talked about those before in school. I remember like the ionosphere and all these different, parts of the atmosphere. And it's interesting to note the Earth's atmosphere contains 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 0.0% carbon dioxide, and then 0.0000765% radioactive carbon, or C14, which mixes equally with the other normal CO2 by the wind currents. So what happens is the sun hits the Earth's atmosphere, and it creates some of this carbon, this carbon dioxide. Portions of that become radioactive. It's radioactive carbon, C14. And so when you hear the term carbon-14 dating, that's what they're talking about. They're looking at the amount of radioactive carbon, and there's a certain amount in the atmosphere, and because it's in the air and it's in the CO2, what do the plants do? The plants take in the CO2. That's what they do during photosynthesis. They breathe in CO2. And guess what we do? We eat the plants, or we eat the animals that ate the plants, and so we end up with radioactive carbon in us. We end up with C14, carbon-14. We've seen insects trapped in amber, like petrified tree sap. And we talked about this before. It's kind of fascinating. It looks like there could have been 50% more oxygen maybe before the flood. Things were different and all these kind of things. But these, basically you have the sun hitting the Earth's atmosphere, and it produces this radioactive carbon-14. And it combines with oxygen to make CO2. And so that's really, we don't have time to cover it, but that's just all that's happening. These molecules, they collide, and it causes carbon-14. And so we'll just quickly get past these slides. And so the way they try to determine the age of something using radiometric dating is they use something called a half-life. They say carbon-14 is being produced in the atmosphere by the sun. It breaks back down to nitrogen, its parent or daughter element, if you will, at the rate of a half every 5,730 years. So they say every 5,730 years, the amount of that carbon that's radioactive, it halves. And so it goes from half to a quarter to an eighth, and lower and lower and lower as these periods of time go on. So they say, here's what they basically do. They say, we know how much carbon-14 is in the air right now. And when something dies, it should stop taking in carbon-14, right? Because it's taking it in through the plants that it eats or the animals it eats. And so when it's dead, it shouldn't get any more carbon-14. So we can compare how much carbon-14 is in this dead animal to how much carbon-14 is in the air, and we can see what the difference is. And based on the fact we know the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,730 years, we can date these things that were once alive. That's what they'll say. I just want you to understand what they believe. And so we've already covered all this about how the plants take in the carbon dioxide, and animals eat the plants, and they make it part of their body. And so it is assumed that the ratio of radioactive carbon-14 to normal carbon in the atmosphere would be the same ratio found in the living plants and animals. And that may be an okay assumption. So for example, if there's 0.0000756% radioactive carbon-14 in the atmosphere, you could assume the same amounts in the plants and the animals that eat the plants and the other animals. And so when a plant or animal dies, it stops taking in more carbon-14, and then whatever it has, it begins to decay. So half of it decays every 5,730 years, and since it cannot gain any more, it will go out of balance with the atmosphere. So that's kind of the idea there, this half-life. It's half, then a quarter, then an eighth, and a 16th. And so here's what they've done. By comparing the amount of carbon-14 in the object being dated with the atmosphere currently in the atmosphere, it can be estimated how long the objects have been dead. So that's what we're talking about. Now I want to say this too. Did you realize that there's more carbon-14 in the atmosphere today than there was 10 years ago or 20 years ago? The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere is increasing. So it's not hit equilibrium. So for people to say that we can use that to accurately date things, that's one of the errors they make and the assumptions they make, because there's not been a consistent amount of carbon-14. But some of those things sound good, but there's a lot of assumptions that are made. So it's estimated, or been estimated, it would take 30,000 years for the Earth's atmosphere to reach equilibrium. That means it's got a certain balance of carbon-14 in there. But like we talked about and I just mentioned a second ago, it's not reached equilibrium. It's still continuing to increase. And so the assumption, or one of the assumptions is made, it's always been the same amount, and that's not true. I want to get to a couple of these other things here, so we're just going to go through these slides quickly. And this is a pretty interesting one right here. So you've got a candle, you walk into a room, let's say over here in our fellowship hall, you walked in there and there was a candle burning. And you thought, okay, let's use some empirical science and let's figure out some things about the candle. The question is, when was the candle lit? That's a good question. This sounds like some fun science, some empirical science. So you can measure the height of the candle, right? How tall the candle is. 7 inches tall. You can measure the rate of how fast it burns. And maybe it burns 1 inch every hour. So you can measure that. So then the question again is, when was it lit? Well, here's some assumptions you have to make. You have to assume to a certain degree how tall it was. And the other question is, has it always been burning at the same rate? The rate it burns is the amount of oxygen in the air, right? You say it's burning at a certain rate, well, take something and put over top of it so it gets less oxygen. There's a lot of assumptions that are made. I want to share this video with you if it will play. And we'll see if it will. And see if we have audio. Stand by, let's see if we can. And then we're going to about be finished here. Let's see if we can get the audio to work. We'll try to see if I can make the audio play through my laptop speakers. Oh, is that what it is? Thank you. Yes, it's all the way down. Good call. Try that now. Of course, I just switched it back to my laptop. switch it back to the display. Try this again. That's loud. Okay.
Nearly every textbook and science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot, but let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind, there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life. That is the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but...
So there you go. Could have just saved all the time tonight and talk about that. But when you see a fossil in the dirt, you just know that it died. You don't know a lot about it because there's all these assumptions that are made about radioactive decay. I want to share a few of these and we're done. These are really funny. Living mollusk shells were carbon dated being 2,300 years old. They're still alive. A freshly killed seal was carbon dated as having died 1,300 years ago. I'm showing you the assumptions that are made and how inaccurate these dating methods can be. Remember, he said these radioisotope datings like potassium argon or these others are used to date rocks when they became solidified after they were molten. Well, carbon-14 is the way that they try to date things that used to be alive. Shells from living snails were carbon dated as being 27,000 years old. I mean, you can see there's great discrepancies in these dating methods. They're not accurate. One part of the Vlasovich mammoth carbon dated at 29,500 years old and another part at 44,000 years old. So one piece of the mammoth was quite considerably older than the other piece, apparently. One part of this baby frozen mammoth was 40,000, another part was 26,000. It's just ridiculous. Here's some really, get some scientific evidence here. This is the same animal, and you'll notice that there's between 17,000 years old to 24,000 years old. And this was muscle from the same animal. There's a huge discrepancy there. Here's another example. Over 8,000 years in the same sample. It's the same sample. The lower leg of the Fairbanks Creek mammoth dated at 15,380, while its skin and flesh were 21,300. Two Colorado Creek mammoths, radiocarbon dated 22,850 and 16,150. Living penguins have been dated being 8,000 years old. Isn't that something? I mean, there's just all these assumptions that go into radiometric dating, and it's not an accurate science. 11 human skeletons, the earliest known human remains in the Western Hemisphere, have been dated by the accelerator mass spectrometer. All 11 were dated about 5,000 radiocarbon years or less. So they can't, really get anything right. It's maybe that one's right, but maybe it's not right. There's all these assumptions that are made. Materials from layers where dinosaurs are found, carbon dated at 34,000 years old. See, these are dinosaurs. They said they went extinct 65 million years ago, so it doesn't really help their cause in a lot of cases. It actually hurts their cause. And if you think about it, because there's the half-life of carbon-14 is 5,000 and some odd years, after about 30,000 years, carbon-14 dating really doesn't work anymore. So that's another thing that's interesting about it. And so we're almost done. And so a geologist, this guy Swisher, uses the most advanced techniques to date human fossils. And he used two different dating methods. The bones were 53,000 years old at the most possible and no more than 27,000. I mean, that's a huge discrepancy in the date. That's a 96% error. That's ridiculous. And so we got to think about this. Here's things to consider about carbon-14 dating. The sample of known age, radioisotope dating doesn't work. A sample of unknown age and radioisotope dating, it's assumed to work, but it doesn't. So in other words, they've taken these samples of like a penguin that's alive, and they know it's not even dead yet, or they take something that just died, freshly died, and it radiocarbon dates to be so many thousands of years old, dead. It doesn't work, so why would they assume it would work for samples that we don't know the age of? And so that's just a fun little fact about all that. So we don't have time to go into any more else. There's a lot of things about other dating methods, like they talked about the age of the rock layers and the rocks. Potassium argon dating is another one that you can ask me questions about. I probably don't have all the answers, that's for sure. But these are definitely not accurate dating methods. They'll use these types to date rocks. And so it's past time, so we're going to just call it a night and call it a creation study. And there's just not enough time to cover all these things. I was looking to see if there's any other slides that were worth one last look. And so leave you with this, and we're done. Have fresh dinosaur bones been found? Well, they have found bones that had red blood cells and things that were pliable. They found soft tissue in dinosaur bones. How could there be soft tissue in dinosaur bones if they've been dead for 65 million years? And so there's over and over and over again, there's all this evidence that we have a young earth, according to what the Bible says, and that all these ways that scientists say they know exactly how old things are very fallible dating methods. There's all kinds of assumptions made. And the more you know about that kind of thing, the more you can see when you're watching the Discovery Channel and they say millions of years ago, you can say, how do they know that? Well, the answer is they don't know that. And so I hope you've enjoyed our study of creation. There's never enough time to cover all of this, but we're going to finish it up and wrap it up for the time being and move on to other fun things on Wednesday nights. So if you would, stand with me and we'll be dismissed in a word of prayer. And I'm going to pick on Brother